Today, I will tell you the powerful and tragic story of Lady Jane Grey, a young girl whose life was shaped and destroyed by the ruthless politics of Tudor England. Known as the 9 Days Queen, Lady Jane Grey was only about 16 years old when she was placed on the throne of England in 1553. She did not seek power, nor did she fully understand the dangerous position she was forced into. The story of England's briefest reign is one of the most fascinating and misunderstood chapters in British history. It centers around a teenage girl who became a queen without truly seeking power, without preparation for leadership, and without any real control over the dangerous world of political ambition that surrounded her. To understand what England's briefest reign really means, we must look at the unstable political situation of Tudor England and how a young girl was placed at the very center of it. In the mid-1500s, England was a nation going through intense change. The country had broken away from the authority of the Pope under King Henry Roman VIII, creating the Church of England. This new religious system caused fear, tension, and deep division across the land. Some people supported Protestant reforms, while others remained loyal to Catholic traditions. Religion wasn't just about faith at this time. It was about power, identity, and who controlled the future of the country. When Henry Roman VIII died, his young son, Edward VI, became king. Edward was only a child, so the country was ruled by advisors and noblemen who made decisions in his name. These powerful men wanted England to remain a Protestant nation and feared what would happen if a Catholic ruler returned to power. This fear became the foundation of everything that followed. Edward VI grew very sick as a teenager. Everyone around him knew that his death would bring chaos because he had no children. According to normal royal law, the throne should have passed to his half, Sister Mary, who was a strong Catholic. This terrified the Protestant nobles. They believed that Mary would undo all religious reforms and punish those who supported the new church. Rather than accept this, a group of powerful men began to look for another option. This is where the idea of England's briefest reign was born. They chose Lady Jane Grey, a young noblewoman with royal blood. She was intelligent, fluent in several languages, and deeply educated in religion and classical studies. However, she was never trained to be a ruler. Her life had been focused on learning, obedience, and devotion to her faith. She lived quietly, far from political battlefields or royal ambitions. The nobles saw Jane not as a leader, but as a solution. She was related to the royal family, and more importantly, she was a committed Protestant. With her on the throne, they believed they could control the government while keeping their own power secure. Jane was married to Guildford Dudley, the son of the Duke of Northumberland, the most powerful man behind this plan. This made her even easier for them to influence. The truly tragic part of England's briefest reign is that Jane didn't even know what was about to happen to her until it was already decided. One day, she was escorted to London under what she thought were normal circumstances. Then suddenly, she was told that King Edward VI had died and that she was now Queen of England. Historical accounts suggest that she was shocked, frightened, and deeply confused. She reportedly cried and resisted at first, saying that the rightful heir was Mary, not her. This moment is what makes her reign unique in history. It did not begin with celebration or ambition. It began with fear. On paper, Jane became Queen of England in July 1553. The crown was placed on her head in the Tower of London, which was traditionally used as a royal residence before coronations. But even as she sat on the throne, real power remained in the hands of the men who had placed her there. She was a symbol, not a ruler. This is why her reign is called the briefest. It was not just short in time, it was thin in authority, weak in support, and built on a foundation that cracked almost immediately. Meanwhile, Mary, the rightful heir, did not quietly accept what had happened. She declared herself the true queen and began gathering support. The people of England, especially in rural areas, saw Mary as the legitimate ruler because she was the daughter of Henry Roman VIII. Unlike Jane, Mary had strong public recognition and emotional loyalty from the people. Within just a few days, the political situation completely shifted. The same nobles who had supported Jane began to panic. Soldiers refused to fight for her. Towns refused to recognize her authority. The support that had once seemed strong vanished almost overnight. This sudden collapse revealed the fragile nature of her reign. It existed more in documents and planning than in real control of the country. What makes England's briefest reign so historically important is not just the number of days it lasted, but what it reveals about power. It shows how royalty could be treated like a chess piece. It shows how a crown could be placed on someone's head without their real consent. And it shows how fragile political plans can be when they are built on fear instead of legitimacy. Jane's reign lasted only 9 days. 9 days that changed her life forever. These 9 days were filled with confusion, isolation, and fear. She remained inside the Tower of London, not as a prisoner at that time, but as a queen who could not leave. Outside, the world was turning against her, even though she had no real choice in becoming part of this dangerous game. By the end of those days, the idea of her as queen collapsed completely. The council proclaimed Mary as the true queen. Jane was quietly removed from power. There were no large celebrations of her fall, no dramatic battles in the streets, just silence, betrayal, and sudden loss. But the story of England's briefest reign does not end there. The consequences of those 9 days would follow Jane for the rest of her very short life. This moment in history became symbolic. It represents how fragile authority can be. It shows how power can rise and fall without the consent of the person most affected by it. And most importantly, it reminds us that behind political events are real human lives, often young, vulnerable, and unprepared. The world remembers Jane not because she ruled well, but because she barely ruled at all. And yet, her brief reign left a permanent mark on history. The end of England's briefest reign was not marked by loud battles or dramatic public celebrations. Instead, it unfolded quietly, almost painfully, in the shadowed corridors of power where decisions were made without the voice of the person most affected. When Jane Grey was removed from the throne, she did not protest or fight for power. In fact, history suggests that she felt relief. The crown had never been her wish, and the pressure of being used as a political symbol had weighed heavily on her young heart. Once Queen Mary was proclaimed the rightful ruler, Jane's status changed instantly. She was no longer treated as a queen, but as a prisoner. The Tower of London, which had been her temporary royal residence during her reign, became her place of confinement. This change happened quietly, without ceremony, without explanation, and without empathy. One day she was addressed as Your Majesty, and the next she was simply Lady Jane. This sudden fall from the highest position in the country to captivity shows the fragile nature of power. In many ways, her situation reflected the instability of England itself during that era. Power did not belong to the most deserving or the most prepared. It belonged to whoever commanded loyalty in that moment. At first, Queen Mary showed mercy. She understood that Jane had been used by powerful men and did not see her as the main enemy. Jane was kept alive, confined, but largely forgotten by the court. For a brief time, it seemed her story might quietly fade into history, and she might live out her days in isolation rather than lose her life. However, politics in Tudor England was never calm for long. Rebellions overheated the country. Discontent grew, not because of Jane, but because of anger toward Queen Mary's policies, especially her religious decisions and proposed foreign marriage. Some rebels believed Jane could still be used as a symbol to challenge Mary's rule, even though Jane herself had no involvement or desire to return to power. Her name once again became dangerous. This is one of the cruelest aspects of England's briefest reign. It did not end when the crown was taken from her. The consequences continued to follow her, even when she had no control over events. For the ruling queen, the existence of Jane became a political risk. In a time where rebellions could be sparked by symbols, a living former claimant to the throne was seen as a threat, even if she personally wanted no power. The government began to view her not as a girl, but as a danger to stability. Her short reign, which lasted only 9 days, had now become the reason she could not be allowed to live freely. That is the tragic logic of power in history. Even unwilling participants can become permanent threats simply because of their position in the past. England's briefest reign also reveals something deeper about the nature of monarchy. A king or queen was not just a human being. They were a symbol of national identity, religion, power, and future direction. By placing Jane on the throne, the nobles had turned her into a political symbol. And symbols, once created, could not be easily erased. During her imprisonment, Jane remained deeply religious and reflective. She spent her time reading, thinking, and writing letters. She accepted her fate with a maturity far beyond her years. Her intelligence and calmness during captivity impressed even those who believed she should not have been made queen in the first place. Her story spread quietly through England. People began to see her not as a political rival, but as a tragic figure, a young life caught between ambition and betrayal. Over time, sympathy for her grew, and she came to be remembered not as a failed queen, but as a victim of power struggles she never chose. The true historical importance of England's briefest reign lies in what it teaches us about manipulation, legitimacy, and human cost. It shows how easily systems of power can sacrifice individuals to maintain control. Jane's 9-day reign was not about success or achievement. It was a warning embedded in history. Even though her time as queen was incredibly short, the impact of those 9 days was permanent. Her story influenced how future generations understood royal succession, legitimacy, and the dangers of political overreach. It became an example used by historians to show how fragile even the highest positions in society can be. Another important part of this story is how memory works. Jane Grey did not have time to prove herself as a ruler. She had no chance to make laws, lead armies, or shape policy, yet she became one of the most remembered figures in British royal history. This is because her story connects power with innocence, authority with vulnerability, and ambition with tragedy. In the end, England's briefest reign was not just about 9 days on a throne. It was about how a nation's fear turned a girl into a queen. It was about how ambition turned loyalty into betrayal. It was about how politics turned a human being into a symbol. And it was about how history would never forget those 9 days. Even today, when people talk about the shortest reign in English history, they are not just talking about time. They are talking about a lesson that power without truth is fragile, and thrones built on fear will always fall. Lady Jane Grey's brief reign was not a story of victory. It was a story of warning, a warning that still speaks across centuries. The story of political manipulation and power struggles during the short reign of Lady Jane Grey is one of the clearest examples in history of how powerful individuals can shape events behind the scenes while appearing loyal and lawful. This period of English history shows that the most dangerous battles are not always fought on open fields, but in quiet rooms where promises are made, secrets are shared, and people become tools in plans they never created. In Tudor England, power did not flow only from the crown. Real power belonged to the advisors, nobles, and court figures who surrounded the monarch. They controlled information, controlled access to the king, and influenced decisions that determined the future of the nation. This created an environment where manipulation was not just common, it was necessary to survive. When King Edward VI was alive, England was already governed by men who used his youth and illness to create policies that favored their own beliefs and ambitions. Among these men, John Dudley, known as the Duke of Northumberland, became one of the most powerful political figures in the country. He understood that true control was not about wearing the crown, but about controlling the person who wore it. As Edward VI's health began to fail, fear began to spread through the political elite. They were not afraid of death itself, but of what death would bring: a shift in power. Princess Mary, the rightful heir, represented a political future they did not want. She was Catholic, independent, minded, and unlikely to be controlled by the same men who had ruled under Edward. This fear did not lead to honesty or democratic process. Instead, it led to secret meetings, rewritten documents, and illegal plans that reshaped the future of the nation. One of the key tools of political manipulation was the creation of the Device for the Succession, a document that altered the normal order of inheritance. This paper was designed to bypass Mary and Elizabeth and place Lady Jane Grey on the throne instead. What makes this act so powerful is that it was not openly debated in public. It was created quietly and pushed through using pressure, loyalty, and fear. Jane Grey did not sit in those meetings. She did not design these plans. She did not vote on her own future. She was discussed like a solution, not like a person. This is how political manipulation works at its most effective level, when the person most affected has no voice at all. Behind the grand language of loyalty to religion and national safety were very real personal ambitions. Men like Northumberland wanted to keep their positions, their land, and their influence. By placing Jane on the throne, they could rule through her. Her youth and inexperience made her the perfect figurehead. The struggle for power also existed inside the royal council. Not all members fully supported the plan. Some were hesitant, some were afraid, and some were torn between loyalty to law and loyalty to survival. But fear of being seen as traitors was stronger than their conscience. When powerful men feel threatened, silence becomes a form of agreement. Political struggle is not always loud. Often it is quiet, calculated, and disguised as responsibility. Jane's forced marriage to Guildford Dudley was another strong example of manipulation. Marriages among nobles were not about love. They were strategic tools. By marrying Jane to Northumberland's son, the Duke made sure that even if Jane became queen, his bloodline would be tied directly to the throne. This was power planning at its most precise level. What makes this story even more disturbing is the speed at which these plans moved. England's future was changed not by the people, not by law, but by a small group of men acting in their own interest. The public had no idea what was happening behind closed doors until it was too late. Once Edward died, the plan was activated immediately. Mary was not informed. She was not warned. Instead, She was declared illegitimate in secret papers, while Jane was rushed toward a crown she never asked for. This is where political manipulation becomes dangerous. It does not just change who rules, it breaks trust between leaders and the people. It creates a gap between law and action. It turns governance into a private game rather than a public responsibility. But no manipulation is perfect. Even the most carefully designed political plans have weaknesses. The greatest weakness of this plan was public belief. The people of England might not understand all the politics, but they understood one simple truth. Mary was Henry Roman VIII's daughter. In their minds, legitimacy mattered more than paperwork created by fearful men. While nobles manipulated documents, Mary gathered support from common people. While councils argued in private chambers, villagers pledged loyalty to a familiar name. This revealed something important. Manipulation can shape systems, but it struggles to control hearts. The power struggle now moved into a dangerous stage. It was no longer just about papers and meetings. It was about loyalty, fear, and survival. Nobles began to rethink their positions. Support that had seemed solid started to shake. This is the nature of power struggles. They are built on trust that can disappear overnight. Most powerful historical turning points are not caused by one action, but by tension building slowly over time. By the time Jane was placed on the throne, the struggle between legitimacy and manipulation had already reached its breaking point. England was not just choosing between two queens, it was choosing between lawful succession and political control. Lady Jane Grey stood in the middle of this storm, not as a creator of conflict, but as its symbol. Her reign, even in its early stage, showed how dangerous it can be when power is concentrated in the hands of a few men who believe they know what is best for a nation. They did not ask the people, they did not honor tradition, they did not offer choice, they only protected themselves. Political manipulation thrives in fear, and during those tense days, fear was everywhere. As the political tension grew, the true weakness of manipulation began to reveal itself. Plans created in secret often collapse in public, because they depend on silence, fear, and obedience rather than trust. Once Queen Mary began gathering loyal supporters, the stage shifted from hidden meetings to visible division across the country. Power struggles are rarely about ideology alone. They are driven by survival instincts. The men who had supported Lady Jane Grey did not suddenly believe in her cause out of loyalty or faith. They believed in their own survival, and when survival was threatened by Mary's growing strength, their loyalties changed quickly. This sudden shift exposes a harsh reality of political power. Allegiance is often temporary, and loyalty can disappear when danger approaches. Members of the Royal Council, who had earlier signed papers declaring Jane Queen, began to hesitate. Private conversations became cautious. Promises were quietly withdrawn. Some began sending secret messages to Mary, assuring her of their future loyalty. In politics, this behavior was not seen as betrayal. It was seen as intelligence and self-preservation. Jane, trapped inside the Tower of London, remained unaware of how fast the world outside was changing. She had no control over the soldiers, no authority over decisions, and no influence over those who had placed her on the throne. She sat in isolation while men decided her fate from safe distances. This is one of the most powerful lessons of political manipulation. The person used as the symbol often has the least power. As Mary approached London with increasing support, the balance of power officially shifted. The council publicly abandoned Jane and declared Mary as the rightful queen. This decision was not made out of justice. It was made because the political risk had changed. They were no longer choosing based on belief. They were choosing based on survival. The struggle did not end when Jane was removed from the throne. Power struggles never truly end. They simply change form. For those who had engineered the original plan, consequences followed. The Duke of Northumberland lost his position and his influence. The power he had so carefully built collapsed in the same way it had risen quickly and violently in political terms, though we avoid graphic detail. His example became a warning to others that manipulation can elevate a person rapidly, but it can also destroy them just as fast. Another important aspect of political power struggles is how they create invisible victims. While the focus often remains on kings, queens, and nobles, ordinary people suffered from the instability as well. Uncertainty meant disrupted trade, fear of change, and anxiety about the future. A nation in conflict, even without open war, lives under a shadow of fear. Mary's victory did not automatically bring peace. She faced her own political challenges, her own betrayals, and her own struggles. This reminds us that power is never truly secure. Every ruler stands on fragile ground, especially when their rise to power is surrounded by conflict. For Jane, the power struggle was not a game, it was her life. She was no longer seen as a person living quietly in noble society. She was now permanently marked by politics. Even though she had never sought the throne, she could never fully escape the role she was forced into. This is the long-term impact of political manipulation. It does not end when plans fail. It continues through memory, fear, and caution. Historians often study this period as a lesson in how personal ambition can reshape an entire nation's path. A small group of men, in their attempt to protect themselves, placed an innocent girl in danger and destabilized the country. This was not a mistake of ignorance. It was a calculated risk, and it failed. The collapse of their plan also showed the strength of public opinion. While nobles played their games in secret halls, the people developed their own sense of right and wrong. They chose legitimacy over manipulation. They chose familiarity over strategy, and in doing so, they reshaped history. Political struggles are rarely black and white. There are no perfect heroes and no perfect villains. There are only people driven by fear, ambition, loyalty, and survival. This period shows how quickly these emotions can shift, and how destructive they can be when mixed with power. Jane Grey became the silent center of this storm. She did not give speeches. She did not command armies. She did not design laws, yet she carried the weight of all their decisions. Her story is not just about a girl who lost a crown. It is about a system that allowed manipulation to replace justice. In the end, the power struggle did what it always does. It destroyed trust. It weakened institutions. It left scars in political memory, and it taught a lasting lesson, that power taken through manipulation is never stable. That control built on fear cannot last. That a throne won through secret deals will always face rebellion. Political manipulation created the brief reign of Lady Jane Grey, and political struggle ensured its collapse. This chapter of history remains one of the clearest warnings about what happens when ambition is placed above humanity. Not because of battles, not because of bloodshed, but because of choices made in silence. The phrase, "a pawn in the Tudor succession crisis," perfectly describes the tragic role of Lady Jane Grey in one of the most unstable periods in English royal history. To be a pawn means to be used and moved by more powerful players, just like a small piece in a chess game. Lady Jane Grey was exactly that, not a decision maker, but a young girl placed into a dangerous political situation by powerful adults who treated her life as part of their strategy. The Tudor succession crisis began when King Henry Roman VIII died, leaving behind a complicated family and an uncertain future for England. Henry had broken England away from the Catholic Church and created a religious divide that would shape the nation for decades. His three children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, represented different religious and political futures for England, which made the question of succession extremely sensitive. When Edward VI became king, he was young and sickly, which meant real power often rested with his advisors. England was effectively being ruled behind the scenes by powerful noblemen who were deeply invested in keeping the country Protestant. They feared that if Edward died and Mary took the throne, England would return to Catholic rule and their own influence would disappear. This fear is what turned Lady Jane Grey into a pawn. Jane was related to the royal family and was known for her intelligence, strong religious beliefs, and obedient nature. But most importantly to the powerful men around her, she was easy to control. She was young, inexperienced, and deeply trained to respect authority. She was the perfect candidate for men who wanted to rule through someone else without wearing the crown themselves. When Edward VI became seriously ill, his advisors rewrote the rules of succession in secret. Instead of allowing Mary or Elizabeth to inherit the throne, they created documents that named Jane as the new queen. Jane was not asked for her opinion. She did not campaign for power. She did not seek the throne. She was selected like a tool rather than respected as a person. This is the heart of what it means to be a pawn. The Tudor succession crisis was not just about who would be king or queen. It was about religion, international politics, and personal survival. Foreign powers were watching England closely. The Catholic and Protestant worlds were in conflict across Europe. Whoever ruled England would influence alliances, wars, and the balance of power far beyond British borders. Jane stood in the middle of all of this without fully understanding the danger. When Edward died, Jane was suddenly told that she was the rightful queen. Historical accounts suggest she was shocked and frightened. She reportedly cried and resisted at first, saying that Mary was the true heir. But she was surrounded by powerful men who had already decided her fate. Resistance was not truly an option. For 9 days, Jane sat on a throne that was never meant to be hers. During this time, the real battle was happening outside the palace walls. Mary, the rightful heir, began gathering popular support. The people of England recognized her as Henry Roman VIII's daughter and felt she had a legitimate claim. Jane, meanwhile, was largely unknown to the public. She had no army, no public loyalty, and no chance to prove herself. She was not playing the game, she was being played. The succession crisis shows how dangerous it is when political systems ignore legitimacy and replace it with fear-based planning. Jane's short reign collapsed because it was never built on public support or lawful tradition. It was built on anxiety and manipulation. When Mary gained enough support, the men who had placed Jane on the throne quickly abandoned her. That is what happens to pawns in a power struggle when they stop being useful. They are left behind. Jane's fall was quiet but devastating. She did not flee. She did not fight. She accepted what happened to her with maturity beyond her years. This made her story even more powerful in the eyes of history. She was not ambitious. She was not cruel. She was not power-hungry. She was a victim of a broken system. The Tudor succession crisis eventually ended when Mary secured the throne, but the cost had already been paid. A young girl's life was destroyed by political fear and ambition. Her name became a symbol of innocence trapped in a ruthless political game. Historians often use Jane's story to explain how personal ambition can distort national destiny. The crisis was not inevitable. It was created by choices made in secret. Jane was not meant to fix a problem. She was used to delay the inevitable. In the end, being a pawn meant that Jane never truly had control over her future. Every major event in her life was decided by someone older, more powerful, and more afraid of losing control. Her story teaches an important lesson about history. The most tragic figures are often not the villains or the heroes, but the silent ones forced into roles they never wanted. Lady Jane Grey was not a queen by ambition. She was a queen by exploitation, and that is why history remembers her not for how long she ruled, but for how unfairly she was used. The story of Lady Jane Grey cannot be fully understood without examining the role of one of the most influential figures behind her rise to the throne, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. In the complex political world of Tudor England, Northumberland was not only a powerful nobleman, but also a skilled manipulator and strategist. His decisions, ambitions, and fears shaped the events that placed a young girl on the English throne and ultimately led to her tragic fall. John Dudley was born into a family of nobility and learned early the importance of politics, alliances, and loyalty. By the time Edward VI became king, Dudley had risen through the ranks of the court to become one of the most powerful men in England. He was ambitious, calculating, and deeply aware that his influence depended on controlling the king and the policies that governed the nation. In an era when the monarch was young and inexperienced, the real power often rested with advisors like him, and Northumberland excelled at wielding it. Northumberland's central goal was to maintain Protestant rule in England. The country was still deeply divided by religious conflict, and many of the nobility feared the return of Catholic influence under Mary Tudor. Dudley saw himself as a protector of the Protestant cause, but his personal ambitions were also entwined with his political mission. By controlling the succession, he could secure his own position, wealth, and legacy while shaping the future of England according to his beliefs. When Edward VI's health began to fail, Northumberland recognized an opportunity. The young king was dying without a male heir, and the natural successor was Mary, a devout Catholic. Northumberland feared that her accession would not only reverse Protestant reforms, but also threaten his own influence. To prevent this, he crafted a plan to bypass Mary and place Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant and a distant relative of the king, on the throne. This plan was both strategic and personal. Jane was married to Northumberland's son, Guildford Dudley, which meant that if Jane became queen, Northumberland's family would be directly connected to the monarchy. This marriage made Jane the ideal figurehead, intelligent, obedient, and deeply committed to Protestantism, who could be guided and influenced by Northumberland and other advisors. The Duke of Northumberland was careful to present his actions as lawful and necessary. The legal justification came through Edward VI's device for the succession, a document that altered the line of inheritance to favor Jane over Mary. While this document was technically questionable, Northumberland used his political authority to enforce it. He worked behind the scenes to gain support from the council and secure key military and administrative backing. His skill lay in combining legal maneuvering with personal influence, ensuring that Jane's claim appeared legitimate while masking the ambition that drove him. Northumberland's role also involved managing the delicate balance between ambition and public perception. He needed to move quickly to secure Jane's position before Mary could organize resistance, yet he also had to avoid appearing as a usurper. This required careful planning, coordination with allies, and persuasive communication with other nobles. He relied on promises, incentives, and threats to maintain loyalty, demonstrating both political cunning and ruthlessness. Despite his meticulous planning, Northumberland's strategy had inherent risks. His power was tied to the perception of control. Once Edward died and Mary began gathering support, the fragile network of loyalty he had built quickly unraveled. Soldiers refused to fight for Jane, towns refused to recognize her authority, and the council began abandoning Northumberland's plan. His careful manipulation could not withstand the strength of public opinion and the legitimacy of Mary's claim. Northumberland's failure illustrates the limits of political control. Even the most skilled strategist can be undone when the population and key institutions do not support the plan. His personal ambitions, though carefully calculated, were ultimately insufficient to secure lasting power. Moreover, his role highlights the human cost of political maneuvering. Lady Jane Grey was the central figure in Northumberland's plan, yet she had no agency. She became a pawn in a struggle she did not understand and could not influence. Northumberland's ambition placed her life in danger, showing how personal desires of powerful figures can directly affect the lives of the vulnerable. After Jane's removal from the throne, Northumberland's downfall was swift. He was arrested, tried, and eventually executed for his role in the succession crisis. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreach in politics. While he achieved temporary influence and managed to shape events for a brief period, his legacy is forever linked to the manipulation and tragedy of Lady Jane Grey's brief reign. Historically, the Duke of Northumberland is often viewed with complexity. On one hand, he was a skilled statesman who understood the mechanics of power and governance. On the other, his ambition and willingness to manipulate the line of succession for personal gain reveal the darker side of political strategy. His role emphasizes that in Tudor England, power was rarely absolute, and influence could be both a tool and a weapon. In conclusion, the Duke of Northumberland played a decisive role in the rise and fall of Lady Jane Grey. His ambition, political skill, and religious motivation created the conditions for her brief reign, while his overreach ultimately led to failure and tragedy. Northumberland's actions exemplify the intense political maneuvering of Tudor England, where the ambitions of powerful men could shape the destiny of nations, but also destroy lives. Through his story, we understand how politics, ambition, and strategy intersect, often at the expense of those caught in the middle, making Lady Jane Grey not only a historical figure, but also a symbol of how human lives are intertwined with the ambitions of the powerful. The religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics was one of the central factors that shaped Lady Jane Grey's brief reign and the political turmoil of Tudor England. Understanding this conflict is essential to understanding why a teenage girl could be thrust onto the throne and why her 9-day reign ended so abruptly. In the 16th century, religion was far more than personal belief. It defined politics, power, alliances, and even survival. Choosing a religious side was often a matter of life and death, and rulers could shape the entire nation's future through their faith. The Protestant Reformation had begun earlier in Europe with figures like Martin Luther, challenging the authority of the Catholic Church and promoting new interpretations of Christianity. In England, the Reformation became deeply intertwined with the monarchy. King Henry Roman VIII broke away from the Pope in Rome, establishing the Church of England. This split was initially motivated by personal and political reasons, but it also aligned England with the Protestant movement spreading across northern Europe. Henry's decisions created a nation divided, with some nobles and citizens embracing the new Protestant faith and others remaining loyal to Catholic tradition. When Henry Roman VIII died, the question of religion became inseparable from the question of succession. His son, Edward VI, was a Protestant and supported the continuation of religious reform. During his reign, Protestant policies were strengthened. Churches were reorganized, Latin services were replaced by English ones, and Protestant clergy were promoted. Edward's advisors, many of whom were Protestant, worked tirelessly to ensure that the young king's death would not result in a Catholic restoration. Princess Mary, Henry Roman VIII's eldest daughter, represented everything the Protestant faction feared. She was a devout Catholic who had been raised in the old faith and had experienced persecution when her father broke from Rome. If Mary became queen, Protestants feared that Catholicism would return as the dominant religion and that those who had supported the Reformation could face punishment. For them, the succession was not only a political issue, but also a religious one, a battle for the future soul of the nation. This religious conflict created the conditions for Lady Jane Grey's rise. Jane was a committed Protestant and had been educated in the Protestant faith from an early age. She understood Scripture, theological principles, and Protestant doctrine far better than most of her peers. For the Protestant nobility, Jane was the ideal candidate to maintain the reforms of Edward VI and protect their religious and political interests. They saw her as someone who would preserve Protestantism and prevent a return to Catholic authority. The religious stakes made the political situation even more dangerous. Succession was no longer a neutral matter of lineage or law. Every decision had moral, spiritual, and political consequences. Choosing the wrong heir could lead to a reversal of policies, persecution of religious leaders, and a shift in alliances across Europe. The Protestant advisors who orchestrated Jane's rise were acting out of both ambition and genuine fear for their faith. Mary, on the other hand, represented the Catholic counterpoint. She was determined to restore her mother's religion and the authority of the Pope. Her supporters were equally committed to Catholicism and saw Jane as an illegitimate Protestant interloper who threatened their beliefs. The conflict, therefore, was not just about who would sit on the throne. It was about which religion would dominate the kingdom and shape English identity for generations. During Jane's 9-day reign, this religious tension was palpable. Her ascension was supported almost entirely by Protestant nobles, while much of the population and military loyalty still leaned toward Mary. The conflict was not fought with armies at first, but with public opinion, legal documents, and alliances. The Protestant faction attempted to legitimize Jane's claim through Edward VI's succession device, while the Catholic faction rallied around Mary's birthright and traditional legitimacy. The religious dimension also affected Jane personally. She was deeply aware that she was being used as a religious symbol as much as a political one. Her Protestant faith became a central reason why the Duke of Northumberland and other advisors selected her for the throne. She was expected to uphold Protestant principles, defend Protestant reforms, and act as a moral figurehead for the cause, even though she was only 16. This immense burden, combined with her lack of real political power, highlights how religion amplified her vulnerability. Ultimately, the religious conflict determined the outcome of Jane's brief reign. While her Protestant supporters attempted to enforce her claim, the wider population's allegiance to Mary, combined with loyalty to traditional succession and Catholic beliefs, ensured that Jane could not maintain her position. The struggle between Protestant and Catholic forces had tipped in favor of Mary, leading to Jane's swift removal from power. The consequences of this religious conflict continued long after Jane's fall. Mary, I would attempt to restore Catholicism in England, leading to persecution and political instability. Protestantism would not be fully restored until Elizabeth I's reign, but the events surrounding Jane's rise and fall demonstrated how deeply religion could influence politics, succession, and even personal fate in Tudor England. Lady Jane Grey's story exemplifies how religion and politics were inseparable in this period. She was chosen as much for her faith as for her royal blood. Her brief reign was the result of a complex struggle between Protestants and Catholics, a struggle that shaped the entire kingdom and altered the course of history. Her life reminds us that in Tudor England, faith was not only a matter of belief, but also a tool, a weapon, and a reason for survival or downfall. In conclusion, the religious conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism was central to Lady Jane Grey's story. It explains why a teenage girl could be thrust onto the throne, why her reign lasted only 9 days, and why her life became the tragic symbol of a nation divided. The Protestant vs. Catholic struggle demonstrates how deeply intertwined religion and politics were, and how ideological battles could determine the fate of individuals, families, and even entire nations. Jane was not just a queen for 9 days. She was a Protestant symbol in a time when religion dictated the destiny of England itself. The Tower of London, a centuries-old fortress on the banks of the River Thames, has long been a symbol of royal power, political intrigue, and imprisonment. For Lady Jane Grey, the Tower was not only a physical space, but also the setting of her personal tragedy. Her brief reign as the 9 Days' Queen ended not in open battle or public disgrace, but in confinement within the cold, stone walls of the Tower. Understanding her imprisonment provides deep insight into the political, social, and emotional realities of Tudor England. When Jane was removed from the throne, she was no longer treated as a reigning queen, but as a prisoner. The Tower of London, traditionally a royal residence and defensive stronghold, had long been used to detain high-profile prisoners, particularly those whose political or religious influence posed a threat to the crown. Jane's imprisonment was not immediate punishment in the traditional sense. Initially, it was a precautionary measure to prevent her from being used as a figurehead in further rebellions against Queen Mary I. In the eyes of Mary and her advisers, a former claimant to the throne, even one as young and innocent as Jane, could never be allowed to walk freely in the kingdom. The conditions of Jane's imprisonment were strict, but not entirely brutal. The Tower was designed to isolate important prisoners from the outside world. Jane was kept under close watch, with guards controlling her movement, visitors, and correspondence. Her confinement was as much a political necessity as it was a personal punishment. Every day, she was reminded of the fragility of her position and the reality that her 9 days as queen had ended. Despite her youth, Jane displayed remarkable composure, reflecting her intelligence, education, and inner strength. During her imprisonment, Jane was allowed some comforts, such as access to books, writing materials, and the ability to communicate with a few trusted attendants. She used this time to reflect, write letters, and study, demonstrating her disciplined character. However, this confinement also underscored the human cost of political manipulation. Jane was no longer a queen in the eyes of the law, but she remained at the center of a political storm, trapped by the ambitions of others. The Tower became a place of forced reflection, where she could neither fully act nor escape the consequences of decisions made by powerful men around her. Her imprisonment also highlights the dual nature of the Tower itself. On one hand, it was a luxurious and secure residence for royals and nobles, providing safety and protection. On the other hand, it was a prison, a place where those who threatened the political or religious order were isolated, monitored, and removed from society. For Jane, the Tower represented both security from potential assassins and a loss of freedom. It was a reminder that, in Tudor politics, status and safety were temporary, especially for those who became pawns in the struggle for power. Psychologically, the imprisonment was a test of Jane's resilience. Being confined at such a young age, with her life in constant uncertainty, required emotional strength. She faced isolation, the loss of authority, and the knowledge that the very people who had placed her on the throne were no longer allies. Yet historical accounts suggest that Jane remained composed, devout, and reflective during her confinement. She focused on her education and faith, using the Tower as a space to prepare herself for the challenges she could not control. Politically, her imprisonment was also a signal to the nation. Queen Mary needed to demonstrate that Jane no longer held power, but she also had to navigate public opinion carefully. Jane's youth and innocence were widely known, and executing a teenager prematurely could have created sympathy for her cause. By placing Jane in the Tower, Mary neutralized her as a threat without immediate bloodshed. The Tower, therefore, functioned as both a physical barrier and a tool of political messaging. During this time, communication was tightly controlled. Jane was allowed to see only a few attendants and was under constant guard. Any letters or messages she sent or received were scrutinized to ensure she could not secretly coordinate with supporters or fuel rebellion. This constant oversight emphasized the precariousness of her position. Although she had once been queen, Jane now had no agency in political matters and was entirely dependent on the decisions of others. Her life, though protected in the Tower, was no longer her own. The Tower also became a place of observation for historians, chroniclers, and future generations. Jane's behavior during her imprisonment was recorded as a testament to her intelligence, piety, and courage. She maintained her dignity and composure, qualities that later generations would admire and remember. Her imprisonment, therefore, was not only a personal ordeal, but also a moment that defined her historical legacy. Jane's time in the Tower illustrates the intersection of politics, religion, and personal fate in Tudor England. She had been used as a political tool, elevated to the throne to serve the ambitions of the Duke of Northumberland and other Protestant nobles. Once her usefulness ended, she was confined to prevent further political disruption. The Tower, in this sense, was both a protective fortress and a prison of circumstance, encapsulating the fragile nature of power in the 16th century. Ultimately, her imprisonment was a period of waiting, reflection, and inevitable realization that her fate was no longer in her hands. The Tower walls became a symbol of the constraints imposed by political ambition, showing how even the highest titles cannot shield individuals from manipulation and consequence. Jane's ability to endure this period with calm, faith, and intellect reflects her extraordinary character, making her story both tragic and inspiring. In conclusion, Lady Jane Grey's imprisonment in the Tower of London represents the human cost of political maneuvering and the intense pressures of Tudor succession. It highlights the ways in which political necessity, public perception, and personal ambition intersected to control the life of a young queen. The Tower was more than a prison. It was a place of reflection, observation, and, ultimately, a stage on which the consequences of manipulation and power struggles played out. Her time there serves as a reminder of the fragility of authority and the profound impact of political conflict on individual lives, marking one of the most poignant chapters in the history of Tudor monarchy. The story of Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, culminates in a tragic and unforgettable event: her execution. This moment not only ended her short and manipulated life as queen, but also became a symbol of the dangers of political ambition, religious conflict, and the vulnerability of youth in Tudor England. Lady Jane's death illustrates how power struggles and political expediency could have devastating consequences for those caught in their path. Jane Grey was only 16 or 17 years old at the time of her execution, an age when most teenagers today are finishing school or learning basic skills of independence. Yet, in the eyes of history, she was elevated to the highest position in the kingdom and later condemned to death because of political calculations beyond her understanding. Her age and inexperience made her an easy pawn for powerful nobles, but also highlight the extraordinary injustice of her fate. Her execution was the result of multiple overlapping forces. First, the political ambition of men like the Duke of Northumberland had placed her on the throne. When Mary I gained power, she initially showed mercy to Jane, recognizing that the young queen had been manipulated rather than acting out of personal ambition. However, Jane's survival became increasingly dangerous as plots and rebellions emerged. Jane's very existence represented a potential rallying point for those who opposed Mary's rule. In this way, Jane was not executed because of personal crimes, but because she had been a symbol of conflict. The religious aspect of her execution is also significant. Jane was a committed Protestant, and her brief reign had been supported by Protestant nobles hoping to maintain reforms established under Edward VI. Mary, a devout Catholic, viewed the restoration of Catholicism as essential to stabilizing her rule. Jane's position as a Protestant figurehead made her a potential threat to the religious and political future Mary sought to establish. Religion and politics were inseparable, and Jane's death was entangled in both. Despite the political and religious forces that led to her execution, Jane remained dignified and composed until the end. Historical accounts describe her as facing her fate with courage, showing calm and intelligence that impressed even those who witnessed her death. Her behavior during her final days and hours became an enduring part of her legacy, demonstrating that even in the face of unavoidable tragedy, personal character could shine. The execution also reflects the methods and practices of justice in Tudor England. In that era, execution was both a legal punishment and a political tool. It was meant to remove threats, demonstrate authority, and discourage rebellion. While Jane's execution was tragic, it served a practical purpose for the ruling monarch. It eliminated a symbol that could inspire dissent. Her youth and manipulation were secondary concerns in the eyes of the crown, illustrating how law and power were often intertwined with political necessity rather than morality or fairness. Jane's death also highlights the human cost of political games. She had been elevated to the throne through no choice of her own and subsequently condemned because of decisions made by others. Her execution underscores the fact that young individuals in royal or noble families often bore the consequences of adult ambition. Even intelligence, education, and personal virtue could not protect Jane from the harsh realities of political life in Tudor England. Moreover, her execution left a lasting impression on English history and memory. Jane became a symbol of innocence destroyed by political intrigue, a young life sacrificed on the altar of ambition and religious conflict. Writers, historians, and artists have remembered her not for her failures as a ruler, but for the tragedy of her circumstances. Her story continues to evoke empathy and reflection on the dangers of manipulation, the fragility of power, and the vulnerability of those caught in conflicts beyond their control. Another striking aspect of Jane's execution is how it demonstrates the role of public perception. While her death was a political necessity for Mary, it was also a delicate situation. Executing a young girl who had been manipulated by powerful nobles could have generated public sympathy and potentially sparked unrest. Jane's courage and composure softened the perception of her as a threat and emphasized her role as a tragic victim rather than a political agitator. This shows how executions in Tudor England were not only acts of punishment, but also carefully managed public events with political implications. Her execution also provides insight into the broader context of Tudor succession and governance. The monarchy was both a symbol and a source of power, and anyone who threatened that power, even unintentionally, could face fatal consequences. Jane's rise and fall exemplify how fragile authority could be, and how political systems prioritized stability and control over individual justice. In this sense, her death was both an outcome of personal manipulation and a reflection of the broader challenges of governing a divided and volatile nation. Finally, Jane's execution reminds us of the human dimensions of history. Beyond political calculations and religious ideologies, her story is about a young person caught in circumstances far beyond her control. Her fear, courage, and composure humanize a historical figure who might otherwise be remembered only as a political pawn. Her death emphasizes the enduring impact of decisions made by powerful individuals and the vulnerability of those without agency in shaping their own lives. In conclusion, the tragic execution of Lady Jane Grey represents the culmination of political manipulation, religious conflict, and the vulnerabilities of youth in Tudor England. Her death was not a punishment for wrongdoing, but the result of circumstances beyond her control. It illustrates the human cost of ambition, the complexities of succession, and the ways in which political and religious factors could dictate life and death. Jane's story endures because it combines historical significance with profound human tragedy, serving as both a warning and a memorial to a teenage queen whose life was shaped and ended by forces far greater than herself.